Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next portal campaign office hours for the Lichen and Bryophyte portals. And welcome to anyone else who's joining us who's not part of the Lichen or Bryophyte consortia, but are just interested in hearing about checklists. We're very excited about our session today. Frank and Matt are going to be leading, and then I'll probably just be posting stuff in the chat as we go. So thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Frank and Matt.
Yeah, hi and welcome. And I will be sharing my screen shortly about my talk or our talk that Matt and I put together. Obviously, much of it, what I'm going to be talking about is from a Lichen perspective, so don't be annoyed with that. I mean, I hope that the Bryophyte folks will just enjoy this as much as I do. I think the checklists generally are a tool that's very powerful, but much underappreciated and not well understood. And I think it's really great to have so many people interested in them. So I will, without much further ado, get started and share my screen. And here I have prepared a little, let me just hide some stuff so I can better navigate this all. By the way, if you want to interrupt me in between, that should be fine.
We'll throw questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, without much further ado, we're going to be talking about checklists today, and I will give a brief overview of what checklists basically are. And then I will try to show you and demonstrate you some of the consortium resources, and I use mostly the Lichen portal for that. And then I will talk in that context about the difference between dynamic and manually curated checklists, and about some different approaches of creating these checklists using vouchers, so specimens as reference specimens from the portal, versus the traditional way, which people probably are much more aware about the literature. And then I will show you how some of these things can be done. Anyway, here are quite a few resources that I'd like to share with you. So there is a great Symbioto support group meeting, a recording of that on YouTube. And there's a general tutorial also on YouTube about how to create checklists. And then there's, of course, the Symbioto docs documentation of how to create checklists. So you might want to go have a look at these first. They are quite extensive. But there's also a really neat publication by Mackenzie Lam and Mackenzie Lam Bell and Landrum, Les Landrum in Kenosha. How about creating checklists? And most of these examples, they feature checklists that were created in Cynet, which is another big Symbioto portal. And I recently published, together with colleagues in Ecuador, some of my students, some of people I work with, a publication in the Lichenologist that is open access about using these tools to create checklists. And I used the example of the checklist of Ecuador that you can access in the portal, of why we might want to use these tools. Anyway, what are checklists? So checklists, they are basically simply saved list of taxa, and they can be applied to virtually any geographic region. So they could be locally of your backyard, they could be in a particular county, state, or country, or they could even cover entire regions like across the Andes or whatever region you're interested in. You can create dynamic checklists by simply putting a dot on the map, and then the portal, the software will search all the collections and then create automatically such a checklist. But much more sophisticated checklists can be done if you curate them manually. And when you do that, what you basically do, you may or may not select certain reference specimens that you think are good vouchers documenting why a certain species occurs in your area. And generally, these checklists, they are children of what's called inventory projects, so they can be grouped together in larger projects. So you might have several checklists, say, for example, all the checklists from the United States, and then several checklists in that project from, say, Arizona, North Carolina, whichever state you're working on. Here is an overview of the checklists that are existing in the two current portals, the Bryophyte Consortium and the Lichen Consortium. So if you're interested in seeing all the checklists that are currently available, then you can use these links and go there and have a look. I just, as an example, what that looks like. So here's a checklist of here's an inventory of all the checklists that exist in the Bryophyte Consortium. Yeah. So again, going back to my talk. Now, what are checklists actually useful for? So these saved lists of taxa are essentially wonderful tools to document biodiversity. So what often people call classically floristics, if I could spell it right. And they're basically inventories and surveys of certain areas, and they're documenting the biodiversity there. But they can also be a research tool, so investigating species in a certain area. So for example, I again put the link there for the Ecuador checklist. That is an example where we have collaborated with lots of different people from Ecuador to put this list together. And an underappreciated thing that checklists can also be useful is for improving and reviewing the data quality. And when I show you how the voucher tool works, how checklists can be constructed from specimens that are available online in all the different databases, all the different collections, that will illustrate you that you will actually have a chance to review the data. And then by ordering these specimens on loan, checking their identifications, and returning them to the institutions, it's also a tool to actually improve the quality of what data we have online in the consortium. And then, of course, various lists can be used as reference lists. For example, if you go to the Lichen portal, there's a list here, a world checklist of the genera of lichenized fungi. So that is something quite useful. And then there's also a red list of threatened species, or an IUCN global red list of species. The threatened ones that are least concerned, and the ones that are data deficient. So they can be important reference lists. And you might want to use or consider using checklists for teaching and training. So if you go out to a BioBlitz or a targeted inventory of a certain area, or maybe just in a class, you do a field trip with your students and you go to a certain area, you can quickly compile a checklist and use that checklist to tell students what species are in that area, so that they have a clue what they might expect and might be collecting in that area. I use that all the time for my Lichen class, so I'm teaching lichenology in the spring, and I provide the students with these checklists when we go on field trip. And last but not least, at least in the Lichen portal, you can use checklists for species identification. Just to give you an example here, if you go to the Lichens of Arizona, then you can toggle between different views. And this is the view of using the checklist as a key. And when you click these characters here on the right, then the species count is being narrowed down according to the characters. And then you can identify specimens. So for example, this is a lichen that grows on this is a Lichenicus fungus that grows on lichens, and it has massidia, so spores masses, forming spore masses. And so that is the only one species in the Arizona checklist for which these characters are correct. So that is something that is not available currently in the Bryophyte portal, but theoretically you could construct your tool matrix, your character matrix, and then you could use checklists for identification as well. In the Lichen portal, this doesn't always work very well. It of course depends on having those characters coded for a particular region. And in Arizona, we are fairly lucky that we do have coded most species. But in other regions, if you go to South America, for example, or even Asia or some region somewhere else in the world, that doesn't work quite as well. So just to give you an idea what these checklists are, I've been talking about dynamic species lists and manually curated lists. So just to show how the dynamic species lists work, you do have, if you go to the menu up here, a sub-menu called dynamic species list, and that's the one you might want to check. And when you do that, it gets you to a map. And well, in North America, since we are in English here, that map is focusing mostly on North America, but you can basically go around, navigate on the map, and then what you can do, you can put simply a dot on the map. And if you do that, you can place a dot on that map, and then you select a certain radius, or you just leave it blank. Say we want to find everything that's in the portal in a radius around these coordinates, then I can build a checklist that will essentially return the species from that particular area. And this doesn't work very rapidly right now, but here you can see that in that particular dot, within a radius of 10 kilometers, there's only a single thing that has been collected from this particular area. So if you increase the radius, or you leave this blank, and again you put the dot on the map somewhere, and you build the checklist, then of course the system will return you things according to the radius that the system selects, and you probably end up with more specimens. So in this case, I put the dot on the map, and the system searched in a radius of 145 or so kilometers, and it returns a list of about 360 or so different species from that area. So that's a very quick way of just getting a rough idea of what is known for a particular area. But of course, we are all aware of the limits of using this data, because many of the specimens that are automatically searched throughout the portal might have problems associated with it. So it's possible that, for example, the identification of the specimens is outdated. So they're using old names, the packets have old names. Or it's also quite possible that many of the identifications are not necessarily correct. You might have a student who identified the specimen. So constructing these dynamic checklists only gets you a certain quality, meaning the portal pulls information from everywhere and just quickly puts it together as a checklist. So if you want to use this tool for creating more sophisticated lists, then basically what you should be doing, you should be creating those checklists manually. And when you do that, you also have different options. You can view a checklist or display a checklist in different ways. You can, of course, display the scientific names, and that's typically always the case. They will always show in your checklist, right? But you might also decide to organize the names either by family or strictly alphabetically by genus and then by species. So the default normally is that checklists are shown by family, organized by family. And that's because, for example, in vascular plants, this is a very useful way to organize your list, possibly in Bryophytes too, but in lichens at least, the families have been changing quite a bit. And so I typically prefer showing checklists organized alphabetically, strictly by genus and species. You can also choose whether you want to display the authors of a particular taxon, and whether you want to display notes that you want to add to your checklist, and include voucher specimens. Or as an alternative, you can also switch the view and show only images of your list. So when you choose images, then many of these other aspects are void because they can't be displayed together with the images, but theoretically, if you have a list that's very well correlated with a lot of really good images, then you could quickly create yourself an image key for going out to the field and facilitating the search what you're looking for. Now, the big advantage of using checklists in Symbiota is basically that it provides you with a tool to link specimens from various different collections, not just your own collection, but all across the different collections in the portal. And that can be very useful because if I create a checklist, say, of species of lichens known from Arizona, then I'm not limited to looking at the specimens in my own herbarium, but I can include all kinds of specimens from a much broader pool of material that has been collected. So from the Field Museum, from the New York Botanical Garden, from any collection that is basically a member of the consortium. Then I can also include notes, and those notes can either be public, visible to everyone, and they might be notes that tell me something about whether that species is common, rare, whether the record is problematic or not. Or I can keep notes private to myself and share them only with people who have access to editing these lists, so with the other editors of the list. And like I said, at the end, some of these portals, the Lichen Consortium, if they have a character matrix, then I can even construct identification keys using the checklist. So when I create checklists, I can manually add taxa one by one. I can also batch upload specimens from an existing list. So if I have a CSV, basically a spreadsheet of data that already has a bunch of information, then instead of manually adding things one by one, I can batch upload this spreadsheet. And finally, I have a very powerful tool that allows me browsing all the records that are already online, and I can specifically select which ones of these vouchers I want to trust and use as for documenting the occurrence records in a certain area. And I can then also use that tool to see, okay, which specimens do I want to review, and maybe I can then reach out to the institutions who host these specimens, ask for loan material to review how accurately these identifications are. Then there's some more advanced tools that I will probably show you only rather very quickly. You can organize checklists hierarchically. So basically you can have a parent checklist and you have a child checklist. So you could have a checklist of, say, the United States as the parent, and then all the different states would be child checklists. And the checklist, the children, they feed the data into the parent. I can also create checklists of rare, threatened, and protected species. And for these checklists, they're particularly powerful because including species in such a list then hides their occurrences from the public. So you have to have access to see those rare and threatened species if you want to see them. And so for some things that you are particularly concerned about, is say in your state you have species that you want to make sure are not being collected, then you could create for that subset of species a child checklist that's a rare, threatened, and a protected species list. And what also very often happens when you work on these inventories, then very frequently things have been reported from a certain area, but you now have good evidence that these species no longer occur in that area. And so you can create species exclusion lists as children that don't feed the data into the parent. There are certain limitations that I will also briefly talk about. It's currently not possible easily without some workarounds to create version histories. So if your checklist changes dynamically from year to year and you do updates, then there's ways to document this, but that's a little bit complicated and you need to use some workarounds to doing that. And currently the checklists are mostly built upon these so-called vouchers, so reference specimens. So adding literature to your list and providing a list of the literature that you have reviewed as documentation of what is reported from a certain area, that's actually also a little challenging. And with that, I will try to show you a couple of things that I've been talking about, and hopefully everything that I've been talking about then becomes a bit clearer. And I wish I could hide these floating meeting controls. They always keep popping up. So if I go to the consortium of lichens, then basically, just to recapitulate, you can create checklists really quickly as a dynamic species list. So if you click on that menu, you get the map, you can put a dot on the map, and you can define the radius around which the system searches all the collections from the portal to create a list automatically. You also can browse a menu of these species checklists here, where you can already look at things that have been created by other people. For example, these global checklists here, you can browse these IUCN red lists. Or you can also go and browse that checklist of genera. Now, one important aspect maybe to mention in this context, you now see my screen, and I'm logged in with my account. And when you look at this, you see that there's a world checklist of genera of lichenized fungi, which everybody can access. But there's also two lists. One list of lichenicus fungi that Tom Nash created, which is kept as private. So this can only be seen by the editors who have rights to see that checklist. And then I'm working with a collaborator in Luxembourg, Paul Dietrich, on creating a world checklist of lichenicus fungi. And so for now, while I don't want to share these the data, this is also kept private. Anyway, so you have the access to all these different checklists that are available, and some of them might be private, and some then you won't see them unless it's your own checklist, and some of them they're publicly available. So these are these inventories that show up basically under this menu. So how do I create a checklist? So basically, sorry, somebody had a comment or saying something? You had questions? Do we want to have a brief question section, or?
Kirsten was just recommending that if you hit Control, Alt, Shift, and H, that is a lot of at the same time, it will hide the Zoom meeting controls.
Control, Alt, Shift, and H. Okay. Yeah, I think they're popping up because the people are still being admitted. So every time somebody wants to get in, they keep popping back up. So anyways, yeah, so just to give you a walkabout how to create your own checklist. So that's actually fairly simple. If you go, you logged in with your account to your profile, then in my case, you see that I'm using this quite extensively. So I've lots of checklists here in my profile. These are the checklists that I have access to, and those are the inventory projects that I have access to. And if I want to create a new checklist, then of course the iconography, so the icons are always the same. The little pencil icon basically allows you to edit an existing thing in the portal. So I could change and edit this Arizona checklist. And the plus icon basically allows me to create a new checklist. So if I want to create a new checklist, the first thing what I do is I give it a name. And I might want to create, for now, a global campaign checklist, say. And then I can say Matt von Matt, if I could spell correctly. We are the authors of that checklist. And here we can select this to be a general checklist. So that's what you typically want to start out with. You want to first create a general checklist, and then you might create a second checklist that is a rare and threatened protected list that would be a child of that general checklist. Or you could create a checklist that's an exclusion list, so a species that you know don't occur in your area but have been previously reported. And you might want to write something about the locality, for example. Say we create a checklist from the Azores in Portugal. Then you can write how this checklist should be cited. You can write an abstract, etc. And you can also then say this should be a child of a more inclusive list, but you have to have access to this list to make your list a child of another list. You can then also go and define what this particular checklist applies to by creating a polygon. So on the map, you basically create an area for your checklist, and then you save it. And I won't do this right now because I don't want to create that polygon, but I will show you how that works in a minute. So you could have your checklist applied to a certain area that doesn't need to be a political area, but it could be any area that you define specifically using a particular polygon. And then there comes a box which allows you to configure how this checklist is being displayed per default. Users can still switch how the checklist is being displayed, but maybe when somebody goes to your checklist, you want to not show only the names, but also the synonyms that are managed by the taxonomic thesaurus. Or you could say, I want to display always the images. Now, if you check displaying the checklist as images, then many of the other options will not be shown because the images, and I'll show you that in a minute, will be pulled from the records in the database, and basically only the images with their scientific name will be displayed. So I typically don't select this option, but this option to use a voucher, so a reference specimen that's connected to your checklist, for the images that are shown, that is an option that I typically select. You might want to click that details, so notes that you put in your checklist are being displayed, the vouchers are being displayed. I like to display the taxon authors, and as I said, in lichens it's usually fairly useful to show the taxa not by families, but alphabetically.
Hey
And
Frank, sorry to interrupt. So by clicking show details, that is showing the rest, the notes, vouchers, taxon authors, and so on. Is that correct? Or are there other details that?
There's other details, and I'll show you in a minute what these details will be and which ones are shown, which ones won't be shown.
Okay.
Yeah. So then this option here might be useful if you're working in groups that have a lot of subgeneric rankings. So say you're working on a group that has different sections. So Sphagnum, for example, is a large group of bryophytes, and it has different subgeneric sections, and then you might want to enable that option. I typically, for lichens, don't find it all that useful. Now you can finally, before you create the checklist, you can say, okay, I want this checklist to be private, but I still might want to share the URL of the checklist with other people. And by setting this private to anyone with link can view, I can share the URL that people can view the data, but they can't modify the data. If I say that my checklist should be strictly private, then only the people who have access as editors to the checklist can actually manage and change the data. And also they are the only ones who are able to view the checklist. And finally, once I'm done with my checklist and I want to publish the checklist, then I might want to switch this option to make the list publicly available. So most often what I select is private, anyone with a link can view that checklist. So if I create a checklist now, then of course that particular checklist will be empty. So there are 3 buttons up here which basically allow me to modify my checklist. The first one is simply the same one as the one I've just been to. So this is the administrative button. So if clicking on this, I can go now and add additional users. So I can, for example, say, Katie Person should be another editor in my checklist. And I can also say, I want to add my checklist to a particular project. So for example, this would be a child checklist, or would be included in the project, in the inventory project, Arizona. I can then go back to this description tab and change and enter data here, modify things, and save this again. So this is what the administration tab is for. Then the next button I want to talk about is this one here on the right. So this one, if you watch the screen, by clicking it, it expands and it collapses a menu that allows you to add species to your checklist. So we have talked about taxonomic thesauri before in one of the previous meetings. The way the system works is you can add any name in your occurrence records when you manage your specimen data. But for checklists, you have only the option to add species to your checklist that are already in a taxonomic thesaurus. So if I start typing here, then that list, and it's a little slow, I don't know why, Furia, well, I'm misspelling. Again, if I could spell. Yeah, so now I can select Buellia sporia from the list, and then I can add a couple of nodes, and these nodes will be the nodes that show up. But I won't add anything now, I just want to show you what fields are available. The first field is a field that I hardly ever use, which is called family override. So the system, of course, in the taxonomic thesaurus includes Buellia sporia in the Caliciaceae, which, according to the most modern taxonomy, is the correct taxonomy. But maybe some people rather think Buellia sporia should be included in a different family. So if you organize your family not by showing taxa alphabetically, you might want to then choose a different family that is the family that you prefer. Then you can put some information of habitat, abundance, some nodes, internal nodes, and something. What's the source for your record in these fields? And all these fields, when the details, as Matt has asked me, are being shown, so display the details, then those details, these fields will basically show up in your checklist. The only field that doesn't show up are the internal nodes, and those are nodes that you might want to use if you're collaborating with other editors on your checklist that basically should not be seen by the public, but only amongst yourselves when you share that information. So by clicking that button, I now have added Buellia sporia to the checklist, and it will be displayed according to these options that I configured when I set up the checklist. So for example, Buellia sporia is now shown with all its synonyms from the taxonomic thesaurus. If I click this option off and I click build list, then now the list is being presented without showing the synonyms. If I click display images, build list, then you see that my options now are suddenly limited. So only the photo pulled from the consortium and the species names will be shown when I display things as images. So I can still show these things differently, even though per default, this was the view that I configured. Now, if I had entered some nodes and some other information here, then that would show up also. But I can do this after I create the list by clicking this little icon here. So I can write something into these fields. And if I submit this and I reload the list, then suddenly now there will be the nodes being displayed growing on rock. However, if I write something into the internal nodes field, these editor nodes, these are the internal nodes. And I built this list, and these internal nodes, they're not shown, but they're still accessible because they're present in the data. Yeah? So now, in addition to adding these specimens manually, which might be very cumbersome, I can also batch upload a spreadsheet. If I click on this button here below the Add Species to List, when this is toggled on, then I can batch upload a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet can have various different things in there. So what is required is, as a minimum, it must have the scientific name. Typically, what Symbiotic calls a C name, so the name without the taxon authors. Then you can also include everything that would be included and associated here, like the family override, the habitat, the abundance nodes, internal nodes, and the source in that spreadsheet. And you have two options of uploading the data. You can either leave the taxonomy as is, so as you have it in your own spreadsheet that you're uploading, or you can change the taxonomy to what the Theosaurus, the central Theosaurus currently accepts. So if in your list you have a synonym of another accepted name, then by changing this to the central Theosaurus, you can upload the list with the most recently recognized synonymy from the portal. So that is typically what I do, but people might have different opinions about taxonomy, so you can also use your own taxonomy and leave the taxonomy as is. So now I have prepared a list from the Azores, and I want to browse there, and here's my CSV from the Azores. Just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to go to Explorer and open this CSV. I generally like to use LibreOffice because you can choose a character encoding, but that's just a side note. So if you look at this, this is a spreadsheet which has the C name in the first column, then also the authors, although they won't be uploaded, they will be ignored. You could have in C name this name with the authors, and the system would still recognize these things. And then in this case, I have got the source, so Abrothalus welwichii was published or reported from the Azores by Haffelner. But I could also have more columns here, like abundance, etc., in that spreadsheet. So now I want to upload that spreadsheet to my checklist. So by doing that, and I want to say to the system, please use the central Theosaurus. So now I upload that checklist. And the first thing that pops up is a bunch of errors. So there's names in here. For example, Diploica canescens is misspelled. So Diploica canescens, if you go to Index Fungorum, you will see that that name doesn't exist. But if I know my taxonomy well, then I know that this is Diploicia canescens like this. And there's that Diploicia canescens. So now I need to find where I were. So these names will now have to be fixed in my spreadsheet so that they upload correctly. And then below this table of the problematic taxa that cannot be resolved because they don't match anything in the Theosaurus is a list of several general errors. So for example, it says Buellia italica failed to load because it was a duplicate entry. So in my original spreadsheet from the Azores, I must have had that name twice. And obviously, if a name already exists and was uploaded, then it doesn't need to be uploaded again. So I can basically save this, fix those names, upload this, the list again, and then hopefully that way get rid of the errors. Whereas with this case, in this case, I don't really need to bother because these are duplicates. So now if I go to the global campaign checklist, I can see that suddenly there's a bunch of more things included. Yeah, all these things are now suddenly being shown. Now we have 382 species in my checklist that were uploaded by this batch upload. Now, the next thing is you will see also that the source field was uploaded. So whatever was in that spreadsheet was uploaded with those names and is now available in the checklist. What is not available yet is any voucher specimens. And that's what the second button here is for. If you want to now check your checklist against vouchers, you can click on this voucher button. And the very first thing that comes up is a query. So you basically need to define the search conditions for this voucher tool to add specimens as reference specimens to your checklist. And I know that I uploaded a checklist from the Azores, so maybe I want to put Azores in here. And maybe if I want, I could also say Portugal. But often it is good to keep the query as broad as possible. So it's possible that, for example, people might have entered specimens from the Azores without their country. And so then everything that has in locality Azores will be caught by this particular query. So when I save these search terms, they're being shown the terms, how the query works up here, and I can modify the query. So now maybe I want to narrow this down and only search collections that specimens from particular collections. So maybe I only want to have the records from the Azores from the Academy of Natural Sciences in Drexel University. If I save this, and suddenly the results that this query returns look different. So in my case, I want to search all collections. I save that again. And so you will see that the query presents you with several different tabs. The first tab tells me, okay, you have 385 species mentioned in your checklist, but virtually all of them don't have vouchers. Yeah. So the first tab shows you all the taxa in your checklist which don't have vouchers, which have no specimens as reference specimens. And then you can either go one by one and check manually if there is material available. So if you click this little link button here, then the portal runs a query and it will look for Thonia atra from the Azores in all the collections. And it finds 1, 2, 3 that are linked as Opegrapha atra. Yeah, so the taxonomic Theosaurus knows that these things are synonyms. And now you could go and say, I want to add this voucher, and I want to add this voucher, but perhaps not this voucher. Then if you go back to your global campaign checklist, then you now see if you search for Thonia atra, that this particular record in your checklist has now 1 2 different vouchers as documentation for these reports from the Azores. Yeah, so that first tab basically shows you, and now the Artonia Atra has disappeared because it has vouchers, and that list now has been narrowed down because I have added vouchers. There's the specimen that I just added. And I will go back to the voucher tool. Now that Amadinea punctata doesn't show up in my tab of non-voucher taxa. There's a different way how to do this also. If you click on here and change the way these things are being displayed, then it shows you a different view of what vouchers you might want to add to your checklist. There's a second tab here that says something quite different. So the first tab shows you all the taxa that currently are included in your checklist but don't have vouchers associated with them. Second tab shows you species that are not in your checklist but in the portal have vouchers. So for example, it found a specimen of Abrothalus pammotrematoides from the Azores collected by Javier Etayo and found quite a bunch of them. So now I could say, okay, if I link this specimen to my checklist, then I not only link that specimen to my checklist, but because I'm linking the specimen to the checklist and the name is not even in the checklist, it will also add that name to my checklist. So by clicking this button here now, I will now add Abrothalus pammotrematis to my checklist. So if I return to my checklist, then this Abrothalus pammotrematis is now included in the list based on this particular voucher. So now the count of the species included in my list will have risen because I added 1 new taxon to the list. This one here I find particularly useful in a different view. You can do this in batch. So when you display the data in batch, then you have a chance to actually review things one by one. And you can decide which ones of these species that are possibly missing from your list, from your checklist of the Azores, you want to add. So for example, you might want to say, okay, I trust this identification of the specimen by Rodriguez in Berlin, this particular specimen, right? But I don't trust these other ones. So that means I only want to include this particular voucher because I still need to verify whether the identifications of these other 2 samples of Acarospora fuscata are correct. And that way you can very much fine-tune which identifications, which specimens you want to add as vouchers and which ones you don't want to add. And when you do this, you can also click everything, or you click particular specimens that you want to add to your checklist. And at the very bottom of the screen, you can decide, I want to add these names with their currently accepted taxonomy, or I want to use the names as they are on the specimen packet. So if I check a bunch of these things, then submit, those names with their vouchers will just have been added to the checklist. Now, if I do this, and I work on this for quite some time, as we all know, identifications change. And sometimes you might run into conflicts where things are included in a list that had their identification changed, not for taxonomic reasons, but because people annotated the specimens. And then suddenly you have conflicts of that you have a thing reported from a particular area, which is based on a voucher that actually is no longer correct because the identification has changed. There's also some sophisticated tools how you can download the data. And these reports here on the last tab, they're actually more sophisticated than if you go to the main checklist view. On the main checklist view, you can also create a Word file. You can have a print view, print the document like this, and you can download the data as a CSV. But if you want to have some more complex records, then you should go to the voucher tool and you should go to the reports tab. So some people, they create the checklist using images, but I personally don't quite like this. And I typically ignore this tab because I think that specimens should be based on physical records that this checklist should be based on physical records that people can be examined. Because we all know that lichens and bryophytes are a little difficult to identify and often cannot be identified from their photo alone. Okay, so this is how you create a checklist. You can manually add things. You can modify the notes. You can batch upload spreadsheets. You can display things differently. You can select specific vouchers as reference material for your checklist. And what you can also do is you can say, I want to create a checklist for a specific area. Something that is not as limited as using the political areas, but where you want to define your specimen checklist based on a polygon. And when you click this option that you want to search things based on a polygon, then that polygon needs to be defined, and currently it isn't defined. Yeah. So either you manually create a polygon and then use it for your checklist, or you can actually load data into this box down here that defines the polygon. And for doing that, I wanted to show you how to load two kinds of polygons in there. And I will create a polygon checklist for that. So I will create a new checklist here. And I won't bother too much with the specifics. I just create the checklist. I now go to the administration tab. And on the administration tab, I want to define it and create a polygon. And the format that these checklists use is a format called VKT. So in a text file, if I look at this, open this with, oh, okay, well, whatever. I'll just open this one. This is from the Red Rock Ranger District. We will put this in here. I save that polygon. And then I open this again. Then I see that this is a polygon of the Red Rock Ranger District in Sedona. And so now if I save this and I go to the voucher tool and I enable the search for that polygon, then it tells me that there are specimens that have been collected in that particular area that I might want to add to my checklist. And if I add these specimens, and then look at it and look at the map, then I see that those specimens are found inside the polygon. So I think we are almost close to the hour. One final thing that I wanted to show you is that you can actually do this much more complex, and you can still do this more advanced. So if you go to the checklist of Ecuador that we recently published, then this checklist of Ecuador has also some children checklist. For example, this lichen forming and lichen checklist of lichen fungi from the Galapagos. And for the Galapagos, I added a bunch of other checklists, previous versions that you can download. And you can also download a reference list as a PDF. So when you look at the source files, these names here, currently there's no literature management system in Symbiota that you can easily add literature records, and something that many people want to do. But what I'm doing is basically I enter these things manually, and then I create a PDF that people can download from the checklist that has all these literature records. So that's one workaround. And in the administration of this checklist, you can include links in your description, and you can link to previous versions of the checklist that people then can download. And so that gets around this limitation that you cannot easily create different versions of the checklist, but at least this way you can share them. And I'm sorry if I took a little long, but this is quite an interesting topic, I think. And I hope you all enjoyed this tutorial. And well, I'm open for question now if people are still willing to stay beyond the hour. So
Hey, hey Frank, I think I talk on behalf of everyone, but this has been absolutely awesome. Some fantastic new tools there. There are some questions that I think Katie has addressed already, but just to confirm from Karen, is it possible to use the latest name on the portal for most species, but use your own for a few exceptions? I think you almost partially addressed that.
yes, so basically, when you go to this display menu on the right hand side of your checklist, you can switch between using your local taxonomy and the display as the central Theosaurus. So when you have different opinions about how these names are managed by the portal, and you want to use, say, species in different genera that you feel like should be used, then you have to make sure that your own taxonomy that you upload is different for these ones. Yeah. So basically, just to show you what I'm talking about, I'll share my screen briefly again. If I go to this one here, then actually when you switch between the original checklist view and the central Theosaurus view, and you rebuild the list, then these numbers might slightly change because the system online handles taxonomy different from the way you uploaded the data. So you have your original checklist view, and you have the view according to the central Theosaurus, essentially.
And Frank, I think you showed it, I just sort of missed it. When you batch upload, you can batch upload all the details as well, like habitat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically again, if you batch upload anything, then these are the fields that you can use. So you have to have at least a species name. Obviously, you can't upload a checklist without a species name. But then all the other things here, if you have them in the spreadsheet, can also be uploaded. And the interesting thing about these fields is that you don't necessarily need to use exactly what these fields are defined as, because the way they're presented here, for example, I've used the abundance field for my Galapagos checklist to denote in blue, and system understands HTML tags, that that particular species is endemic to the Galapagos. So Whether that is a good way of using that field abundance is a matter of opinion, but since only the source field has that label, you can pretty much use the other fields for anything what you like. And you can see from these color codes that you can be fairly sophisticated with that.
That's pretty cool. Is there a character limit on the fields?
Yeah, some of the fields have a character limit. So that, for example, the source field with the literature, I initially started putting like the entire citation in there, but of course that would repeat again and again the same stuff over and over. And also I would be then limited by the size of the field. And so if you have a long citation, then basically at some point it cuts out. So I ended up with this workaround of like citing as like Bunger's 2015 and then creating a PDF as a literature list that I manually upload and provide a link to.
Very cool, Frank.
Can I ask a question, Frank?
Sure.
At the beginning, when you were defining what by default can be shown in the description, at the species, you had show details, and that's a field that's not active on the Bryophyte portal, but seems to be active on Lichen portal. What the show details yes does to the definition? Do you remember that?
I think it shows all these fields like nodes and
like automatically all of them at once. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not sure why. I mean, I must admit, I haven't worked with the Bryophytes because I'm not a biologist, so I wonder why.
I haven't seen that field before, so that's why I'm asking.
It is in the checklist administration. It might just have a different name in the list that comes up on the right side of the checklist. Like I imagine that show details is the same thing as notes and vouchers. I think those are the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sometimes I don't know why, but the interface is slightly different. It shouldn't be. Not.
Yeah, I think different pages were developed at different times, and so then they get the names are not synced. But if you see something like that, feel free to bring that to our attention. That's something that's pretty easy to change.
Thanks, Katie. And I think something just to underscore with everybody. I mean, we've had, just for even education and outreach, we've had like a 15-year-old student just develop a checklist for his backyard, more or less. And it's been a wonderful outreach tool as well.
Yeah, I use it all the time in my class, so it's quite cool, I think. Especially that dynamic tool. I mean, it's rather crude. Like I said, you have a lot of duplicate names that are basically the same thing, or you might have things that are misidentified, but it gives you a very quick way for, if you go to a certain area, to have an idea what people have already collected in that area. Well, I don't know. People are really welcome to ask questions, but if not, I guess since we're over the hour, we don't want to keep everybody for too long. I'm not sure.
Well, I know you invoked my name, Frank, but it was all you. Thank you.
No, at least we had one meeting where we discussed this, so you made some good comments there, so that was helpful too. So
no, but there's a lot I've learned that I want to transfer to our, because we use this extensively, but we haven't used all the tools, which is what I want to do.
all
Well,
right.
thanks a lot, Frank, and also Matt. I just want to remind everyone before they start heading out that there will not be an office hours meeting next week. We're going to spend that doing some back-end work, finishing up the data cleaning, finishing up the GBIF publishing. Make sure you take a look at the emails that Lindsay has sent you most recently about both of those topics. And then we'll reconvene on May 10th at this same time, this same place. And we'll be wrapping up the campaign, talking about some next steps, and just kind of celebrating the successes that we have had as part of this portal campaign. Thanks, everyone, and feel free to stick on to ask Frank any questions. I'm just going to stop the recording now.